Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of the Belonging series, which is Imperial One's candid interview series with people from the BAME backgrounds. And this week, I know we're in for, I say this every week, but this week I am really looking forward to this discussion with Ben Bowling. Ben is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at King's College, London. And he's going to be sharing his experiences, how he got to where he is, and, how he got to where he is. So I'm not going to elaborate on anything else because that's what Ben's going to do for us right now. So Ben, we want to just say a big welcome and thank you for coming. And I'm going to kick off by asking a question with relation to your sense of belonging, where that came from an early childhood. Where did you get your sense of belonging, direction, motivation, etc.?
Thank you. Well, Wayne, thank you very much indeed for having me on your show, and it's great to be here. And hello, Imperial. So, sense of belonging. Well, so it's, I think, quite complex. I mean, my sense of belonging is forged in my childhood experience, growing up in Worcestershire, in a small village. Mm-hmm. One of the only, perhaps often the only person of colour in that village. Mm-hmm. And I think looking out at the world as, I would say, any other English boy. I have to say that was challenged as a child. There were many people, particularly from secondary school onwards, who would question that and say, are you really English? Whether that was through jokes that, were perhaps intended to be funny, but didn't always land right. Like, we must have a black milkman.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
But then in adult years, I think I now see myself as somebody with lots of different roots and experiences. My father's from Guyana. Mm-hmm. My mother is from London. Mm-hmm. I have family in various different parts of the world. I've traveled a lot. And I would say that my sense of belonging, I live in central London. I've lived in London pretty much all my adult life, apart from a few stints in places like America and Barbados, mm-hmm. Spent time in Germany. Maybe my sense of belonging is a cosmopolitan one. I feel myself as a citizen of the world.
A citizen, okay. I like that. I like that. Let's go back a little bit where you were talking about kind of like growing up as possibly the only child of colour in your hometown of Worcestershire, or a little village in Worcestershire. How did that make you feel? Because I'm just thinking about that formation of character. How did that make you feel going through that process?
Well, I think primary school was very inclusive. Mm-hmm. Everybody is different after all. And I think that idea that, we're all different, we're all individual, was very important. I think that racism wasn't a big part of that. I don't really recall any direct hostility or racism at primary school. Secondary school was very different. And I think, of course, this is growing up in the 1970s, in mm-hmm. the era of the National Front, mm-hmm. of, Powellism, of the growth of the extreme right in Britain. And I think that once the politics of racism seeped into the classroom and the playground, mm-hmm. I'd say most people of colour, most Black and Asian, other minority ethnic groups growing up in England, I think we all, of my generation, all experienced various different kinds of exclusion, discrimination from fellow school students, teachers. Even getting to GCSE, I'm actually reasonably good at speaking French. And when I did my GCSE French, my O-level French exam, after the first couple of questions, the examiner asked me, so when are you going to go back to your country of origin?
Oh.
Quand tu reviens à votre pays d'origine, in my French GCSE.
Wow.
Yeah. So how does that make you feel? I mean, I felt and still feel very rooted in England, in Worcestershire,
yeah,
in London. But I am conscious that there is a stream of English racism. It's Englishness with whiteness. So I think, you know, I have quite a solid sort of sense of identity, but I'm conscious that there are people who would reject that, either reject it themselves or reject it on behalf of other people. So I do remember trying to get a job in a pub, and the manager said, the landlord said, I couldn't possibly employ you behind the bar. This was probably about 1980. Couldn't in Worcestershire. Couldn't have you behind the bar. The customers wouldn't stand for it. And he said, you wouldn't like working behind a bar in my pub. It would be a horrible experience. I will employ you as a cleaner. You can stack shelves before the pub opens. You can clean the pub, and you can clean upstairs. But you can't work behind the bar. Now, I don't know whether this is a mark of character or foolishness, but I said yes to that job. I did do it.
Yeah,
I did it for a couple of years, and I spent a lot. I've worked as a cleaner a lot in my life, and it did me a lot of good, but it did mean eating a certain amount of my pride.
Yeah. I just want to explore that a bit more, to be honest, because I understand that you need the job, yeah, but from your own sensibilities, when they said that, what did you have an immediate reaction to it, or how was that? I know you said about so you'd have been a teenager, so I know you have said that secondary school had been a bit difficult as such. So how did that make you actually feel? What was your knee-jerk reaction? I know you took the job, but needs must, as it were.
Needs must. Well, I mean, I had a couple of experiences as a teenager where I feared for my life.
Right.
Where facing skinheads in the street, where where the exclusion was very, very vivid. And I think that probably from the age of about 11, I became aware of racism in British society, kind of intuitively and through direct experience. And I think that I began to, in a sense, accept it as a sort of something which is latent and out there, and railing against it. Now, I mean, maybe I would take a different position now. Railing against it, I think, was not something that I was going to do for my own survival and for my own development. And I think that, you know, I'm not a Christian, but ideas like turning the other cheek, and, you know, moving on. And I think that that is probably something which has been how I have dealt with difficulties in my, you know, personal life and in my career. Is, I mean, you know, in the case of the pub job, does it actually affect me? I mean, I quite like the idea of being a barman, but actually having a career from about the age of sort of 15, 16, well into adulthood as a cleaner was actually a pretty good skill set. I mean, I've been taught to mop on 3 separate occasions.
Right.
Patiently being taught for the 3rd time about, you know, hot and dry, and exactly how hot the water should be, and how to move that thing. And it's, you know, it's okay. I'm getting paid for this training. I'm just. Does it actually hinder me in terms of my? Does it actually hinder me in terms of my experience? I wanted a job. I got a job, but I'm having to, see. Was the person a bigot? He was saying that his clientele were bigoted,
Mm-hmm.
and he probably was correct.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to admit that I am personally a pragmatist in these things. I wasn't being denied a job. I was being given a job.
Yeah.
With conditions.
Yeah.
That I was willing to accept. I got on with my life, and I was okay with it.
No, that's brilliant. You brought up some very interesting points in terms of, actually, some might say that he gave you an opportunity for a job. It might not have been the job, the one which you actually were going for at the time, but he was almost, to some extent, protecting yourself and protecting his business. It was a mutual thing in terms of, he may not have felt, I might be putting words into his mind, but it was kind of like, if you had been behind the bar, the amount of abuse that you may have suffered would have been one thing. It may have said for himself, he would have got people saying they're not coming. So he was pragmatic at the same time, but still gave you an opportunity, and you made the most of that opportunity.
I think I would agree with that. And I think that my thinking about pragmatism, survival, and actually maybe even being able to thrive kind of means asking, is this actually hurting me, hindering my development, or is it a useful life lesson from which I can develop and learn from and move on? I mean, it just brings to mind another example. When I was doing research early in my career, probably my first year of my PhD, so maybe about 1987, and I was doing interviews on a neighborhood watch project. Yeah. And I did interviews in Hackney and around Brixton, and I got stopped by the police, who said that there had been a report of a suspicious-looking person trying doors in the neighborhood. And of course, I was trying doors, knock, like to interview you. And so I explained what I was doing, and nothing bad happened. But I knew that there was twitching of the curtains, and actually that was interesting. It was useful data. Yeah. In this neighborhood, a young black person doing door-to-door interviews was perceived in this neighborhood as a potential threat. Yeah. And then in the same neighborhood, knocked on one door, I think it's my third callback, and I'm on a quota for my interviews. Yeah. And this man opens the door and he says, "I've seen you knocking. I don't normally allow blacks in the house, but come in." And he sat there and he gave me chapter and verse on what black people were like. Muggers and thieves and rioters, and he just went on and on and on. But, the tape was running. And the interview was used in the book. It was called Watching Police, Watching Communities by McConville and Shepherd. Yeah. And it was good data. Yeah. And yeah, of course it was hurtful and unpleasant to experience this, but my job was to be a researcher. Yeah. Not to judge or complain or to, react or to, all of those things. My job was to gather information on what people thought about crime and community, what looked suspicious and so on. And yeah, it was a painful experience. Yes, it was, but it was the job. Yeah. And I just kind of have to admit, I just got on with it. Yeah. I can imagine maybe a more principled person, maybe, or someone a bit less pragmatic, saying, whoa, let's stop the interview. But, you know, that is not my orientation. My orientation is it harming me? Is it getting in the way of what I need to be getting on with?
Mm-hmm.
If it isn't, then I better get on with it.
Could I ask a kind of follow-up question on that? Because the way that you've stated that, it's as though you've been very pragmatic in that my intention here is to gather the data, not necessarily challenge the narrative that the person was giving. So in order, you can challenge the narrative later, but at that moment in time, you just wanted to know what the data was. Am I right in saying that? So it was almost like know when to fight the battle. Would I be right in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. I mean, in relation to the pub job,
yeah,
my goal was to get a job, earn money,
mm-hmm.
you know, leave, you know, get beyond this small village,
mm-hmm.
get off to a city or another country, or do something different.
Yeah.
So, and that's the goal. But I have to, you know, suffer a few kind of psychic wounds and
mm-hmm.
have a bit of a thicker skin.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not getting in the way of what I need to do. Mm-hmm. In relation to the research, the research evidence subsequently analysed, published, fed into policy discussions,
mm-hmm.
can produce real change.
Yeah.
Not to say that I have never challenged,
mm-hmm.
You know, racist abuse, and I would always support colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
When people come to me, you know, I've been in higher education, working in higher education, I don't know how long it is now, 25 years. And people do, and in the civil service too, people will come to me to ask for advice.
Yeah.
And I would often preface, I would typically preface my response by saying, if you want a very kind of principled response, that is, you know, somebody has done something to you or you've heard about which is wrong, and you know, the answer could be, let's take action against this person, let's lodge a grievance or begin a disciplinary or whatever it is. I would always say, what does this mean to you mm-hmm. or to the person who has been affected? Mm-hmm. What will be the result of taking disciplinary or grievance action? Okay. I mean, to me, taking out a grievance or launching a disciplinary action that is going to damage the complainant, mm-hmm. I don't recommend that. Yeah. It's like I don't recommend taking action on principle if it's going to achieve nothing or cause you harm. I would say if you can see the pathway mm-hmm. to and how you can win this, do it. But mm-hmm. if you're going to run into roadblocks, then I would say think again. And I always preface that, and then we can get into the detail and decide on a course of action. Yeah. And the person obviously has to make their own choice. Yeah. But I'm always going to be asking, what is the likely outcome for you in this process?
Yeah. That's really insightful. That really is insightful. It's again very pragmatic. It's about ensuring survival within the situation, and making sure that minimizing damage to oneself, as it were, or not say unnecessary damage, but damage which could be inflicted or could have been navigated through had different decisions been made. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think that my approach to this changed somewhat when I became when I was in senior leadership.
Yeah.
As deputy dean and acting dean, and a lot of people would come, you know, from all areas, professional services, students, other academics. I think I might still have occasionally used a sort of little, you know, I'm a pragmatist preamble, but my approach changed when it's in relation to my role in senior leadership. Right. That's different. If your role is to ensure that your workplace is part of your role is ensuring that your workplace is free of discrimination, is safe, free of harassment or whatever, then the position is different. Then you have to put your own position to one side and, you know, work with the complainant. And actually at that point, I thought, you know, and I did on a number of occasions, put my neck on the block, because it's not about, at that point, it's not really about me. It's about what does this person need to be protected inside an organization? That's a little bit different.
That very good distinction between the two. Can I, we've kind of like roundabout got to where you are in your academic position, but what was it, was there a trigger which got you into kind of the field which you're currently in? Where did that come from?
Good question. Good fortune. I've been very lucky in my career. Well, it didn't look promising to begin with because I failed my A-levels catastrophically. Maths, physics, and biology. And back in the 80s, if you didn't, between an E and an F, there was a thing called an O grade, which said you've got an O level or GCSE after 2 years of study towards your A levels. So I finished my sixth form with absolutely, you know, O.
Oh,
nothing.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. That was really the worst day of my life up until that point. Not all everybody else's fault, you know. I've got to own the fact that I wasn't really studying and I was interested in other things rather than academic study. I did get the A levels in the end. Got to Manchester Metropolitan, took a degree in psychology. In my final year, I did counseling psychology and criminology as options, and found both of them fascinating.
Right.
You know, motivation, really, really important. I'd also, at the end of my first year, met Susie, my then girlfriend, now wife of nearly 35 years.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And I think, somewhere in around the beginning of the second or third year of my degree, I really found the motivation.
Right.
And then spent a year teaching English as a foreign language in Sudan, and then started a PhD at the London School of Economics, which was, I think, a lucky break, possibly a fluke. I was kind of rather underqualified, I would say, to some extent. I mean, the applications to PhDs are different in the mid 80s.
Yeah.
But I think I got lucky. And the PhD was in a department filled with criminologists. And, you know, criminology is a great subject. You know, dishonesty, drugs, sexual deviation, you know, it's you know, interesting.
Lots of interesting things to investigate.
Yeah, and also the police. I mean, I was interested in the police, and my PhD started out looking at police stop and search powers, and ended up being on the police response to racist violence.
Right.
And it you know, it was a topic that I threw myself into. I did my PhD part-time at the LSE over 8 years. Yeah. That was hard.
Yeah.
And kind of fell into it. Yeah. I then worked in the civil service, Home Office for 7 years. Yeah. Got a break to go to New York as an assistant professor, came back to Cambridge, and then got headhunted to come to King's. And that was in 1999, and I'm still here. Fantastic.
That's not kind of like the conventional route which people think of for a professor. They think of this academic brilliance all the way through, but you're saying that it was more about being in the right place at the right time, having the right motivation, and having that self-belief. Did you ever think that you would end up being a professor? This is just a curious question. Did you ever think that you'd end up being a professor?
No. My favorite teacher, Mrs. Thomas, when I went back to, she was the only one who believed in me in sixth form.
Yeah.
And I went back for a reunion, and she kind of took me around all my teachers, paraded me. I got a job at Cambridge.
Yeah.
As a lecturer. And she's going like, see, look, see, told you would do well. No, not at all. No, I mean, when I started my PhD, I had no idea about academia, really.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea how you could become a professor.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 80s, of course, there weren't very many academic jobs. That was why I went into the Home Office,
right,
as a researcher in 1987 or 8.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I had, I mean, certainly not a professor in the law school.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely no clue that I could rise to become an acting, dean of school. That was fantasy land. I'm like, the child of a single parent, growing up in a small village, of average intelligence, who failed his A-levels, and somehow, I don't know really. I mean, I've written a few good books, I would say. I don't know quite how it happened.
I think you downplay. I think you've got a solid work ethic from what we discussed before, and so I think that's also helped. And having found your mojo, as it were, it's helped you to just keep going and aim for wherever you've wanted to go. I'm just I'm conscious of the time, but there's a couple of other areas which I'd like to discuss with you, especially as the fact that one of the things which you had mentioned was that part of your PhD was on stop and search, and then it turned into looking at the impact of policing on the Black community. And so I'm just thinking, yesterday was Stephen Lawrence's day, or today's Stephen Lawrence's day, and it would have been around that time when you would have just been completing your studies, etc., etc. How did that impact your career? How did that impact you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I was finishing my PhD in 1993, at around the time that Stephen Lawrence was murdered on 22nd of April that year.
Yeah.
I always wondered whether there was something important to the thugs of the fact that the following day was St. George's Day. Which is today. I've written about this. There were so many racist murders around that time. I have to admit that I did not think that the Stephen Lawrence murder would be the one that would change the narrative, that would change. I didn't, I kept all the press cuttings. I followed the case in detail, even though my PhD was finished. I don't think the Lawrence case even was included in my PhD, because there were so many from the 80s and, from the 70s and the 80s and the early 1990s. I guess I'd probably just about finished. It then took me 5 years to rewrite the thesis as a book. It came out with Oxford in 1998. And I was having lunch with a colleague at Cambridge just before the book came out. And he was saying, so are you going to contribute to the Lawrence, this inquiry? And I was like, well, I don't know about that. He said, well, if not you, then who?
Good question.
And so when the book was published, I sent a copy to Macpherson, and it was picked up by the bishop, John Sentamu, who was then the Bishop of Stepney and then became the Archbishop of York.
Yeah.
And I got a call at Cambridge. Would you come and, could we have lunch and could you speak directly to the inquiry? I did do a submission as well as the book. And funny thing was, he was like, oh, when I met him, he almost said, I thought I was expecting someone taller, I think he might have said. He said, you don't fit the image of the Cambridge Don.
Okay.
So even the bishop can have a bit of unconscious bias. And there's quite a lot in the book about institutional racism, and he did actually. I met him years and years later, and I was with some friends, and he came up to me and said to my friends, "This man is responsible for institutional racism."
Right.
He was overstating it, but I did do quite a lot of behind the scenes work to make sure that that concept was understood.
Yeah.
The examples of it were used in the inquiry, and the submission was used in the Lawrence inquiry.
Yeah.
And it hadn't occurred to me up until that time that I could contribute to public debate in that way.
Yeah.
So that was 98, and that did change my opinion of what an academic was. And I am now, from then on, understood myself to be an activist academic. Some academics just collect the evidence.
Yeah.
I think the idea is you collect the evidence, you write it up, and then you make sure that that material gets into the public domain as to where it can be used and can make a difference.
Yeah.
I've been involved in advisory work, consultancy, agitation. I contributed to creating an NGO called Stopwatch that feeds academic research on stop and search into the public domain. We've been a charity. It's existed for 10 years now. And it did change my career. Yeah. In the sense that I thought it's important to get out there and represent. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's I like the notion that you put there of being the activist academic, not just somebody who's collating information for having discussions with other dons wherever they are, but it's about the empowerment which comes through the data and through the narrative which the data provides. I really like that concept. I'm just, there's so many questions. I'm just thinking, like, because you've seen one of the driving forces that I see with the Stephen Lawrence situation was the impact of the mother and the father's relentless pursuit for justice. And I suspect from your perspective and in the work which you do, is that part of your motivator as well? That pursuit of justice?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the case of Neville and Doreen Lawrence, I mean, they campaigned for justice for their son at significant personal cost, particularly, I think, well, for both of them.
Yeah.
And yes, I do think that. I think that even though I would say I've endured injustice, on numerous occasions, and I've seen people enduring injustice, maybe because of that, I do feel there were certain fundamental values like, liberty. There's, I think I would like to see a higher quality of liberty. I would like, I am appalled by injustice and inequality. And as a researcher, the evidence has to speak out. It has to speak for itself. And it has to be clear and unbiased. But once you have the evidence, putting it out there and ensuring that, the grease gets to the squeak, if you like, to ensure that when you see things that are not right, that people are being oppressed, or excluded, or abused, I do see that as an important motivating factor for my scholarship and personal life too. I mean, I've always been done voluntary work in various spheres. I was an independent visitor to police stations, doing spot checks on police stations. I've volunteered in the probation service. I've been a volunteer psychotherapist. There's something about civics, civic responsibility to contribute to the world that we live in.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm just wary of time. I always come to this point where I say I have to open it up to see if there's any questions from the audience. I've got about 4 or 5 more questions, but I have to be fair. Is there any questions? I can see Moon Lee had a question in the chat if she wanted, but is there anyone else who has a question? If you want to put your hands up, I see William. So I'll go with Moon Lee, then with William, to bring them in to the conversation.
I think Omar also has a question as well. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. So my question was, as a researcher, so you're talking about, you know, trying to be pragmatic, trying to collect data, and then you were talking about your experiences with people being quite outrageous racist with you, and you're still being very calm about it. Do you think your data collection would have been looking very different if you were a white male? Would that, you know, would you get a different kind of data? And even though even though you know it might be different, what contribution would you hope to make? I don't know what my question is.
No, I think mainly, and thank you. Also, thank you for getting me here to have this conversation. I know you and David have helped to do that. So, so a couple of questions. One is, does the personal demographic characteristics of the researcher make a difference in terms of data collection? And you know, what are the implications of that? I think yes, and I think that in terms of selecting and thinking about, you know, research teams, not in every field. I mean, I'm a King's and an LSE kind of, that's my sphere rather than Imperial. So I don't know, in the hard sciences, things might look a little different. But I think in sociology, social psychology, the background of the researcher definitely makes a difference. I mean, those instances, and there are probably a few more instances that I've experienced, people saying unpleasant things, has been triggered by the fact that I'm brown-skinned. So that does make a difference. And I think that there's a very famous study of police called the Policy Studies Institute, where 2 white male researchers kind of spent a lot of time in the canteens with the police and on patrol. I mean, some of the stuff, this was in 1981, some of the stuff that the police felt free to say to these guys was, it's absolutely staggering. I don't think that they would have got that data if they'd been Black or Asian, or, you know, people of color. I think that was a specific quality. It's almost like, you know, there's often in sociological research a distinction between covert and overt research methods. Yeah. A lot of ethical issues around covert research, but even overt research has a kind of covert quality to it. I mean, one of the things that you can do as a researcher is say, no, you mustn't say that. But if you don't, if you just kind of go, you know, assent, maybe there's a sort of subtle deception that you're giving the impression that you might agree with the speaker. Yeah. That is a way of eliciting good data. So yes, and I think that, I mean, women researchers in criminology have written about the experience of being, you know, a female researcher in a male-dominated profession produces different kinds of experiences. Yeah. Some things are said to women that are both offensive, but also, you know, you get bravado and chivalry, all of these kinds of things, which, you know, if you're interested in masculinity in police organizations, a woman is going to produce different kinds of responses from interviewees or people they're observing than men, and, you know, people of color will produce, I think, different evidence from white people. But of course, I mean, I'm not an essentialist at all. I mean, because my mother is white, My wife is white, and my children are very, diverse in their physical appearances. I don't think of these things as an absolute. I think, at the end of the day, probably we're all mixed, right? So it's not, it's not an absolute. But I do think, yes, there are differences in the researcher, and that does have implications for knowledge, and it does have implications for how that knowledge is used.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
I hope that answers your question, Min.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to move across to William. If you'd like to ask your question, please.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Professor. Yeah, fascinating insights. Trying to think how to phrase it well, I suppose. Given where you are almost, I suppose, as a Black man at the top of the kind of higher education pyramid, I suppose in a sense is how would you characterize that rise, if you like, if on the one hand, given the current debates around race, on the one hand, pull yourself by your bootstraps, there's no racism you can achieve if you want. And maybe on the other end, higher education is systematically racist, as some of the racist as the police force, the criminal justice system, and all of those other systems. So I suppose, yeah, where would you place yourself and your rise, in a sense, to the getting through that system into the top of the pyramid?
Okay, well, thank you for the question, William. And the first thing, I think, if it's climbing a hill, I'm a bit over the hill. I'm on the way down, and actually only part-time now as an academic, and I have another life working with my 87-year-old father, who's a painter. So no longer at the top of the hill, over the hill. So it's a good question. In terms of my own personal practice, I think I probably am, to some extent, a pull yourself up by your bootstraps, have a thick skin, get on with it. If you're knocked down, get up and keep going. And I am inspired by my dad, 87 years old, had a shed load of abuse and exclusion, and has kept on making paintings, and has had to wait until he's in his 80s before he's seen the kind of career success and recognition that I think he truly deserves. So you do have to press on. On the other hand, I absolutely agree that racism, racial discrimination, exclusion have blighted the careers of individuals, and that institutional racism is a feature across the institutions of British society. I guess I would say at a policy level, and in thinking about the role of strategic leaders, it is to do everything possible to ensure that the workplace is one that provides equality of opportunity, even redress, looks at the curriculum, looks at the attainment gap, looks at microaggressions and the experiences that are had by students, professional services, academic staff and others, and seeks to combat that, and takes grievances and allegations of abuse and misconduct and barriers to progression seriously. But at a personal level, I would say one has to strive and to press on. And I would, as I was saying earlier, would advise people encountering these blockages and these barriers not to risk your, getting burned if there is another route. So I would say institutionally, policy, practice has to recognize institutional racism, including in higher education. And at a personal level, press on. And I also do think one additional thing I would say is that I have heard people putting themselves down and creating barriers that are not helpful. I remember my eldest son, who's now an engineer and thriving as a teenager, talking about the down presser and how opportunities were not there for Black people. And I'm like, you live in central London, you're bilingual, very bright, you've got great academic opportunities. Your mother's a teacher, your father's an academic. Do not put yourself in a position where you feel that you're not going to be able to thrive. You can, and you will, and you must, and he has.
That's very sound, solid advice. Thank you. I'm gonna.
But if you're going to ask me specifically, is Tony Sewell talking out of his hat? Yes, he is.
I wasn't going to go there just yet, but, but thanks for clarifying that as well. Right. Omar, can you bring your final question for us, please?
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing with us. I just wanted to know, in light of historic cases like Colin Roach, for example, what your feelings are towards the current setup of the criminal justice system and policing towards Black and brown individuals, I guess.
Well, there's no doubt that there have been many people who have been abused by the system, which is supposed to provide protection, secure liberty, and do justice. I think it is an abomination when a police officer or police organization, which is there to protect, harms people, and deaths in custody, particularly police shootings and the use of excessive force, are things that I find there was stain on British justice. And I've focused my research attention there, and stood alongside campaigners and tried to develop research evidence which can contribute to public debate and to policy and to trying to bring around change. I have written about stop and search since my university days in the 80s. It's still an issue which offends me today. We still see horrendous examples of the abuse of police power. I think that the UK is very different from the USA in terms of the extent of the problem, to some extent the nature of it. So I'm not somebody who thinks that Britain is just as bad as the USA. I just think it just isn't.
Right.
Even though the many of the issues are the same, similar, but the magnitude is a long way away in relation to the evidence. I do think there has been some change and some improvement. Not as fast the change as I would like to see. And I still think there's a long way to go. And I still think that there is a need for research, for activism, and for change. And as I said earlier, I think that we deserve in this country, we all deserve a higher quality of liberty. And we still need to be pressing forward for justice and equality.
Fantastic. I'm just wary of time, and I know that we've gone over. And thanks for staying on. There is just, you made that connection between, it's almost like coming full circle. You made that connection between the US prejudice and criminal justice system in the US and also here, and the differences and similarities. And I'm just thinking, it's an ironic week the week where we're looking at 28 years since Stephen Lawrence's murder, we also then get, in the very same week, the verdict of the George Floyd, and it's the verdict is now murder, you know. So I know you say it's very different, but from that, what similarity or what lessons should we be taking from the situation that we find ourselves?
Yeah. Well, obviously the conviction of Chauvin and the is a good thing, that justice has been done, that police officers do not have impunity to use that level of abusive force, placing your knee on someone's neck for 9.5 minutes it's shocking. The fact that a guilty verdict in relation to murder has been achieved, that police officers do not have impunity, is a step forward. Nonetheless, to me, it's all about accountability. It's all about the question of whether we, as a society, on both sides of the Atlantic, are willing to hold those who wield power to account. And by accountability, I mean to be able to give an explanation of themselves and to provide a justification for their actions, and whether justification doesn't meet the what we would accept in a civilized society, for the appropriate action to be taken. And there are plenty of examples in the UK where power has been abused. There are instances, many instances, that don't come to public attention, that don't come to light at all. There are also many near misses where people face, severely dangerous circumstances at the hands of the police and the justice system, where, if you like, nothing happened, but it was, very, very close to a police shooting or whatever. So I feel that this is an important moment, and I think that what will happen is that in the USA there will be, the George Floyd bill, the inquiry and the investigation into the Minnesota police. I do see this as a moment for progress. I do also think that in the UK, there are many individuals and organizations who, both within the established system, like in relation to, investigating complaints, but also in civil society, like Stopwatch or the Institute of Race Relations, many organizations who exist for the purpose of holding the police and the criminal justice system to account for its failing. And I think that, when police leaders find themselves in this position, they should be saying, we will respond to well-founded criticism, and we will change. And we will make sure that liberty is protected and that the organization is there to protect people rather than abuse them. But we do have a long way to go.
Ben, thank you so much for your candid discussion this afternoon. I know I could just sit here and I could just talk to you for hours, but unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. What I'm hoping is we can possibly bring you back on sometime in the future, and we can have another discussion looking at a different aspect. But it's been absolutely brilliant having you on this afternoon. I'm going to do my usual, which is just to quickly advertise for next week and to let people know what's next. So this week we've had, we've had Ben. Next week we're going to have Rob Neal, who is the director of Crystal Alliance, a former civil servant, and he worked in the Ministry of Justice. So I'm not sure if Ben may know him or not.
I do know Rob. Yeah, we've sat alongside on numerous occasions.
I thought you might, because the area is so aligned. So next week we're going to be having Rob with us, and if you have missed, one other thing before we go if you have missed any of the previous recordings and also this recording, it is available on our YouTube site at tinyurl.com/belonging-IAO. And just if you've got some time tomorrow evening, there will be this critical discussion looking at the state of Black health across the African diaspora. So this would be, you can go to Eventbrite where you can get more information related to this particular activity. But once again, what I'd like to do is just to say thank you very much, Ben, for being our guest this week. And everyone have a good weekend, and I will see you next week. If anyone wants to stay on for the little after party, then please feel free. Thanks again. Bye-bye.